Cartersville, Georgia was a peaceful, close-knit town where everyone knew each other, nestled in the northwestern corner of Georgia. Its main street was lined with small businesses and modest homes. It was the kind of place where children played in front yards, and the sound of laughter filled the air. But beneath this serene exterior, a dark secret lurked. Angela Reynolds, a mother who had lived there for years, harbored a secret so tragic, it would forever alter the course of her life and the life of her 15-year-old son, Tyler. Tyler Reynolds was a bright and ambitious 15-year-old boy. He had a love for art and often spent hours sketching in his room. Despite his artistic talents, Tyler struggled with ADHD, a condition that made it difficult for him to focus and control his impulses. His mother, Angela, found it increasingly challenging to manage him. While Tyler tried his best to meet expectations, his behavior often led to conflict between him and his mother. Angela, in her mid-40s, was a woman who had seen her share of personal struggles. A single mother, she had faced the hardships of raising Tyler on her own. While she loved her son, the weight of being both mother and father to him had worn her down. She often complained about how hard it was to manage his ADHD, his school difficulties, and the constant pressure of being a sole parent. The tension between mother and son grew over the years. Tyler's energetic and sometimes reckless nature often clashed with Angela's need for control and stability. Her frustration with Tyler's behavior became evident to those around her, including their neighbors and friends. Angela would often confide in others, complaining that Tyler was out of control, that he never listened to her, and that she was exhausted from the constant strain of parenting him alone. Tyler, on the other hand, felt misunderstood. He yearned for his mother's approval and affection, but no matter how hard he tried, it never seemed enough. His dreams of becoming a successful artist were often dismissed, and he felt trapped in a cycle of frustration and failure. His ADHD made it hard for him to focus on his schoolwork, and his mother's constant reminders only added to his stress. One evening, Tyler's teacher called Angela with a report of his poor performance in school. The conversation was brief, but it pushed Angela to the edge. She hung up the phone and threw it across the room, shouting, "Why can't you just be normal?" The words echoed in her empty living room as Tyler, sitting quietly in the corner, heard them clearly. The relationship between mother and son seemed to be unraveling. Angela became increasingly isolated. She stopped socializing with her friends and spent most of her time in her home, focusing solely on trying to manage Tyler's behavior. The frustration and exhaustion were taking a toll on her mental health, and she began to retreat into herself. She no longer had the energy for her own needs, let alone the ability to properly care for her son. One night, Tyler approached his mother hoping for some emotional support. He had been working on a new drawing for weeks and wanted to show her his progress. When Angela saw the drawing, her face hardened. "You'll never make it as an artist," she said coldly. "You're just wasting your time." The words hit Tyler like a punch to the gut, but he held his composure. He didn't argue. He just walked away quietly, feeling like a failure once again. That night, Tyler retreated to his room where he stayed up late, sketching and writing in his journal. He poured his heart into his art, the only outlet he had left. Meanwhile, Angela sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television. She felt as though she were living in a cage, trapped by the responsibilities of motherhood and the unrelenting pressure of caring for a son who never seemed to meet her expectations. Over time, Angela's frustration turned into resentment. She resented Tyler for being difficult, for making her life harder than it needed to be. But most of all, she resented herself for feeling so powerless. She had no one to turn to, no one who could understand the burden she carried. The emotional toll of raising Tyler had begun to eat away at her. Tyler, meanwhile, continued to withdraw. His friends noticed the change in him. He no longer laughed or joked like he used to. He spent more time alone, and when he did speak, it was often about how he felt like he was a disappointment to his mother. "She doesn't even care about me," he would say to his friends, though they always tried to reassure him. They didn't know the full extent of the tension between mother and son. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Angela stormed out of the house, leaving Tyler alone. The house felt suffocating, and Tyler, feeling rejected once again, sat down to write in his journal. As he wrote, His frustration and anger poured out onto the pages. He wondered if anyone would ever understand the pain he felt. The next morning, Tyler didn't wake up. Angela, who had been in her room, noticed that the house was unusually quiet. She went to Tyler's room and found him still in bed, his body cold. Her first instinct was panic. She rushed to his side, shaking him violently, but he didn't stir. She checked for a pulse and found none. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. Tyler was dead. Angela called 911 in a panic. She tried to sound calm, but her voice trembled. "My son, he's not waking up. I think he's dead." The dispatcher told her to stay on the line, but Angela's mind was racing. She couldn't understand what had happened. How had her son gone from being fine the night before to being lifeless in his bed? When the police arrived, they found Tyler's body in his room. At first glance, it appeared to be a natural death, perhaps due to a medical condition, but the police didn't take long to start questioning Angela. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play, just a mother's frantic call. Angela seemed oddly calm, too calm, given the situation. The investigation into Tyler's death quickly turned into a murder investigation. Angela's demeanor raised suspicions among the detectives. They discovered that Tyler had been strangled, his neck showing clear signs of bruising. The case took a darker turn when the coroner revealed that Tyler had been dead for several hours before Angela called for help. The timeline didn't add up, and Angela's story began to unravel. Detectives began to look into Angela's past. They discovered that she had been increasingly isolated in the weeks leading up to Tyler's death. Her friends had noticed her erratic behavior, and some recalled her mentioning how difficult Tyler was to handle. A closer look at Angela's internet history revealed chilling searches. How long does it take to strangle someone? And can you kill in your sleep? The evidence against Angela mounted. A search of her home turned up several disturbing items, including a journal with entries detailing her frustrations with Tyler. She had written about how she felt trapped and burdened by him. The entries were filled with anger and resentment, and some even hinted at dark thoughts of what life would be like without him. Angela was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The community was in shock. How could a mother kill her own son? The question echoed through the town, but no one had the answer. Tyler's friends were devastated, and the small town of Cartersville was left to grapple with the unfathomable betrayal that had just occurred. In the courtroom, Angela's defense team argued that she had acted out of emotional distress. They painted her as a mother overwhelmed by the pressures of raising a child with ADHD and struggling to make ends meet. They claimed that Angela had snapped in a moment of weakness, unable to cope with the constant stress. The prosecution, however, presented a different picture. They painted Angela as a cold, calculating woman who had grown tired of her son and decided to end his life. They pointed to her search history and the lack of emotion in her call to 911 as evidence that Angela had planned the murder. It was clear that the jury had to decide whether this was a case of emotional breakdown or premeditated murder. As the trial continued, Tyler's friends testified about his bright personality and the pain they felt at his death. They described him as a kind-hearted boy who loved to draw and was always there for his friends. They couldn't understand how Angela, who had been the one to bring him into the world, could betray him so brutally. The most damning evidence came when the prosecution presented Tyler's last school project. It was a drawing of his dream home where he wrote, "Me and Mom forever." The words struck the jury like a blow to the chest. Tyler's hope and love for his mother had been genuine, but it had been shattered by her cruelty. The jury deliberated for days, but in the end, they found Angela guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Angela remained silent. Her face was unreadable, a stark contrast to the emotional outpouring from Tyler's family and friends. Tyler's memorial service was held at the local church, where the community gathered to mourn the loss of a boy with. The Reverend, who had known both Tyler and Angela for years, delivered a heartfelt sermon. He spoke about Tyler's dreams, his potential, and the bright future he had ahead of him. Yet, beneath the surface of this service, there was an undeniable sense of confusion. How could a mother, someone who had given birth to him, do this? Angela's absence at the service only deepened the sense of loss. Her betrayal was a wound too deep for the town to heal easily. The Reverend, who had known both Tyler and Angela for years, delivered a heartfelt sermon. He spoke about Tyler's dreams, his potential, and the bright future he had ahead of him. Yet, beneath the surface of this service, there was an undeniable sense of confusion. How could a mother, someone who had given birth to him, do this? Angela's absence at the service only deepened the sense of loss. Her betrayal was a wound too deep for the town to heal easily. As the days passed, Angela's trial continued to unfold in a public spectacle. The courtroom was filled with onlookers, some curious, others deeply invested in finding out the truth of what happened between mother and son. The prosecution laid out a chilling case, presenting evidence that Angela had been planning her son's death for weeks. Her internet searches, the journal entries, and the testimony from those closest to her painted a portrait of a woman whose resentment had turned deadly. The defense, on the other hand, painted a very different picture. Angela's lawyer argued that her mental health had deteriorated over time, exacerbated by the overwhelming responsibility of raising Tyler alone. They described a mother who had become a prisoner of her own mind, pushed to the brink of emotional collapse. In their view, Angela's actions were not premeditated murder, but the tragic result of a momentary lapse in judgment, a breakdown under immense pressure. Angela's demeanor during the trial was haunting. She rarely showed any emotion, sitting with her head lowered, her eyes focused on the floor. Many wondered if she was overwhelmed by guilt, or if she had simply become numb to the pain of what she had done. She avoided eye contact with the prosecution, with her family, and even with her own defense team at times. Her silence spoke volumes, leaving many questioning the depth of her remorse, or lack thereof. Witnesses who had known Angela testified about her emotional state leading up to the incident. They described her as someone who had become more withdrawn and angry. A close friend of Angela's spoke about a conversation they had a few weeks before Tyler's death, where Angela had expressed her frustration with her son. "I'm at the end of my rope," Angela had confided, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much more I can take." Tyler's friends were among the most heart-wrenching witnesses. They spoke of the boy they remembered, funny, creative, and full of life. They recounted moments where Tyler had expressed his love for his mother, despite everything that was happening. "He used to say, 'She's just hard on me because she loves me,'" one of Tyler's friends shared tearfully. "He always wanted to make her proud." The prosecution took full advantage of these emotional testimonies, emphasizing the cruelty of a mother killing her son, a boy who still loved her despite the pain she inflicted on him. They argued that Angela had the opportunity to change her relationship with Tyler, but instead chose the path of violence. Her lack of genuine remorse was evident to the jury as they listened to testimonies, including those from medical professionals who confirmed that Tyler had been strangled to death. The defense team, struggling to find any sympathetic angle, relied heavily on Angela's mental health. A psychologist was brought in to testify that Angela had suffered from depression for years. She had been on medication, but it was clear that her condition had worsened over time. The defense argued that while Angela's actions were tragic, they were not entirely her fault. They painted her as a victim of her own mind, a woman who had been pushed to the brink by her circumstances. Angela's own testimony was one of the most anticipated moments of the trial. On the stand, she spoke in a soft, almost inaudible voice, her hands trembling as she clutched the witness stand. "I never wanted to hurt him," she said, tears running down her face. "He was my everything, but I couldn't handle it anymore. He wouldn't listen. I couldn't keep going. I didn't know what to do." Her confession of feeling overwhelmed struck a chord with some in the courtroom, but it wasn't enough to absolve her of her actions. The jury listened carefully, weighing her words, but the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the brutality of the murder left little room for sympathy. Angela had planned the murder, and her mental state, though tragic, did not excuse what she had done. In closing arguments, the prosecutor delivered a powerful statement, urging the jury to think of Tyler. the boy who had been left with no choice but to endure his mother's cruelty. Tyler Reynolds deserved better. He deserved a mother who loved him, who cared for him, and who protected him. Instead, he was left to die at the hands of the one person who was supposed to protect him most. The jury deliberated for several days. The case had weighed heavily on them. They could not ignore the emotional impact of Angela's actions, nor the pain it had caused Tyler's friends and family. Ultimately, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Angela Reynolds was convicted of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the verdict was read aloud. Angela stood motionless, her face pale. The weight of the decision seemed to wash over her in that moment. The judge read her sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Angela's expression remained unchanged as the courtroom erupted into tears. Tyler's friends and family embraced one another, their grief over Tyler's loss compounded by the realization that the woman they had once known was now forever lost to them. Tyler's funeral was held shortly after the trial. The community gathered to say goodbye to the boy who had once brought light into their lives. It was a somber event, filled with tears and sorrow. Friends and family stood in silence, remembering the boy they had lost and reflecting on the senselessness of his death. Tyler was laid to rest in a small cemetery, a place where his memory would live on in the hearts of those who loved him. Meanwhile, Angela was taken to a state prison to begin serving her life sentence. Her world had drastically changed from the woman who had once walked the streets of Cartersville with her son, dreaming of better days. The woman who had killed the very person she was supposed to protect now had nothing left but the empty silence of her prison cell. In the years that followed, Angela's life in prison was marked by isolation. She had become a shell of the woman she once was, trapped in her own guilt and regret. Her days were spent in a constant haze of remorse, but there was little solace to be found. Some inmates reached out to her, offering a sense of camaraderie, but Angela was distant, locked in her own world of self-loathing. The prison system did little to provide Angela with the help she needed. While she had access to mental health services, her case remained one of the most talked about in the facility. Other inmates whispered about her, some expressing sympathy for her, while others considered her a monster. The contrast between Angela's life now and the life she had once had in Cartersville was stark and unbearable. The prison system did little to provide Angela with the help she needed. While she had access to mental health services, her case remained one of the most talked about in the facility. Other inmates whispered about her, some expressing sympathy for her, while others considered her a monster. The contrast between Angela's life now and the life she had once had in Cartersville was stark and unbearable. The letters Angela wrote to her family went unanswered. Her parents, who had once been her support system, now avoided any contact with her. They could not forgive her for what she had done to their grandson. The emotional toll of losing Tyler, coupled with the betrayal from their own daughter, left them in a state of deep sorrow. Outside of prison, the town of Cartersville slowly began to heal. The memory of Tyler lived on in the hearts of his friends and family. Memorials were held in his honor, and his art, which had been discovered posthumously, was displayed in local galleries. The town, which had once been shaken by tragedy, found solace in remembering the bright young boy who had been taken too soon. The story of Angela and Tyler became a tragic legend in Cartersville, one that no one would ever forget. It was a story of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. People would often whisper about Angela's actions, asking how a mother could do something so terrible. But no one truly knew the answer. Only Angela, locked away in her prison cell, could answer that question, if she ever could. Years passed, and Cartersville slowly returned to its quiet, peaceful life. Yet the scars left by Tyler's death never fully healed. The memory of what had happened lingered in the air, a silent reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can reside even in the most familiar places. Angela, now serving her sentence, had no choice but to live with the consequences of her actions. The love she had once felt for her son, the dreams they had shared, were now shattered pieces of a broken past. There was no redemption, no way to undo the pain she had caused. All she had now was the endless cycle of remorse that would follow her for the rest of her life. Tyler's friends, now adults, still carry the memory of their dear friend. His art, his smile, and his dreams remain with them, a bittersweet reminder of the boy who was taken from them too soon. They hold on to the lessons he taught them, the importance of kindness, of following one's dreams, and of cherishing the people who matter most. Years later, some of Tyler's friends, now in their 20s, met to discuss their memories of him. They had grown, but they couldn't shake the feeling of loss, still haunted by the events that had unfolded. Every anniversary of Tyler's death felt like a fresh wound, and they couldn't stop asking themselves why things had gone so wrong. They met at the same diner they had frequented with Tyler, reminiscing about the late-night conversations and laughter they had shared with him. It was there they vowed to keep his memory alive, ensuring that the boy who had once filled their lives with light would not be forgotten. Angela's time in prison had become the subject of a documentary years after the trial. The film, which explored the psychological depths of mother-son relationships, sparked heated debates. Some believed it painted Angela as a tragic figure, a mother who had lost control. Others, however, argued that it failed to hold her fully accountable for her actions. It reignited discussions on whether mental illness could truly be an excuse for taking a life. Despite the public debates, Angela herself remained unchanged. She had received therapy in prison, but it never truly seemed to penetrate her guilt or her sorrow. She had moments of clarity, when she could admit her crime, but those moments were fleeting. The rest of her time was spent in denial, trying to bury the pain with excuses and justifications. Angela's case became a significant talking point for criminologists and psychologists. Some argued that her behavior, her inability to truly confront what she had done, was a symptom of deeper mental illness, one that hadn't been adequately treated or understood in time. Others saw it as the dark side of unchecked anger and resentment, a toxic brew that led her to destroy the one person she was supposed to love unconditionally. Angela was given a new opportunity for a psychological evaluation after serving 15 years in prison. By now, she was a shell of the woman who had walked into court for the first time. Her once black hair had turned gray, and her face was etched with the lines of regret. When she met with a psychologist, she looked more like a broken person than a criminal. The psychologist, after hours of interviews, proposed that Angela's mental state had deteriorated beyond repair. Her emotional breakdown had been more profound than anyone had understood back then. Her unhealthy attachment to Tyler, combined with a severe depression that had gone untreated for years, contributed to her fatal decision. Yet even the psychologist seemed conflicted. Was Angela a victim of her own mind? Or was she simply a person who had allowed her rage and frustrations to eclipse her love for her son? It was a question that no one could answer definitively. Angela's behavior remained unpredictable, a mystery to everyone, including herself. Tyler's mother, before the trial, had attempted multiple times to reconnect with him, seeking forgiveness for their strained relationship. She had written him letters during his teenage years, but Tyler had refused to respond, consumed by his anger at her behavior. Angela had never understood the depth of his resentment, and now, looking back, she regretted every moment she had spent pushing him away instead of trying to understand him. Angela's remorse was only amplified as she spent years in solitude. As the years dragged on in prison, she began to focus on her own regrets, constantly wondering what she could have done differently. But the truth was clear to her now. Tyler's life had been lost because of her inability to cope with her emotions. During one of her therapy sessions, Angela admitted that she had often felt like a failure. Her attempts to be a good mother had always been clouded by her frustration. She had wanted Tyler to be perfect, but he never lived up to her expectations. This internal conflict had simmered for years, fueling the distance between them. Angela finally acknowledged that, in her quest to make him fit her ideal of who he should be, she had lost sight of who he truly was. Angela's letters to Tyler, which had once been a source of hope for reconciliation, now served as painful reminders of the past. Every letter was filled with regrets and unspoken words, but Tyler had never responded. He had given up on her. And Angela, as much as she hated to admit it, knew that Tyler had never been able to forgive her for the hurt she had caused him. While Angela's guilt consumed her, Tyler's friends, those who had been closest to him, worked tirelessly to keep his memory alive. They had created a foundation in his name, aimed at providing support to troubled youth who might be struggling with similar issues. They focused on mental health, offering counseling and guidance for those who were too afraid to ask for help, just as Tyler had been. The foundation also worked on educating the public about the dangers of neglecting mental health issues, especially within families. It was an attempt to prevent tragedies like Tyler's from happening again. The foundation's goal was simple: to teach families the importance of listening, understanding, and nurturing the emotional needs of those they love. Tyler's friends also became strong advocates for victims of domestic violence. They used their own pain to fuel their advocacy, speaking out at rallies, writing articles, and engaging in community outreach programs. Their messages were clear: violence, neglect, and emotional trauma could have a lasting impact on individuals, and it was up to the community to help prevent these problems before they escalated. As the years went by, Angela's case became a chilling reminder of how unchecked emotions could result in irrevocable damage. What began as an ordinary family dynamic spiraled into a nightmare, one that forever altered the lives of everyone involved. It became a story that people would remember, a story of love, loss, and the consequences of emotional turmoil. Angela, now in her 60s, had grown old in prison. Her once vibrant personality had long since withered, replaced by the quiet contemplation of a woman who had nothing left but her thoughts. There was no chance of parole, no possibility of freedom. She was locked in a cage of her own making, and the only thing left to her was the endless cycle of remorse. On the anniversary of Tyler's death, Angela would often stand at her prison window, staring out at the world she could no longer be a part of. She would remember the boy she had loved so much, the boy whose smile had once brightened her world. In those moments of silence, Angela could only feel the weight of her actions bearing down on her, a reminder of the life she had destroyed. The community of Cartersville, though still mourning the loss of Tyler, had found some measure of peace. They continued to remember the boy who had once been full of potential, and they used his story as a lesson for future generations. They spoke of him not only as a victim, but as a symbol of the importance of mental health awareness, the need for families to communicate, and the responsibility of a community to look out for one another. The story of Angela and Tyler Reynolds remained a stark warning, one that would be passed down for years. A story of the fragility of the human mind, the complexity of parent-child relationships, and the devastating consequences of unaddressed mental health issues. It would serve as a reminder to everyone who heard it. Love is a powerful force, but when twisted by neglect and frustration, it can become a dangerous weapon. As Angela's years in prison dragged on, the years of therapy slowly began to reveal deeper truths about her. Her defense had always pointed to her mental health struggles, but it became increasingly clear to those around her that Angela had never fully confronted the reasons behind her actions. She spoke often about her feelings of inadequacy as a mother, but never truly understood how these feelings had warped her perception of reality. She had never seen Tyler for who he was, only for who she wanted him to be. Angela's emotional state became a focal point of discussions within the prison. Psychologists, criminologists, and even the prison's mental health counselors debated her case endlessly. Some insisted that she was a deeply disturbed individual, while others believed that her actions were more the result of years of isolation and emotional neglect than any inherent malice. During one of Angela's group therapy sessions, a breakthrough occurred. For the first time in years, she truly faced her guilt. Her voice, once cold and distant, cracked as she said, "I never really saw him. I only saw what I wanted him to be, what I thought would make everything better. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I hurt him." The therapists and counselors working with Angela were stunned by her raw honesty. They could see the beginnings of an attempt at self-forgiveness, but they also understood that she would never be able to escape the consequences of her actions. The death of Tyler was irreversible. No amount of therapy could undo what had been done, and Angela knew that. For the first time, Angela began to grapple with the true scope of the damage she had caused, not just to Tyler, but to everyone who had ever loved him. The community, her family, and even her own mind were victims of her unresolved trauma and inability to process the deep emotional strain she had been under for so many years. Angela began to see herself not as a mother who had failed, but as a person who had been consumed by her own demons. Tyler's foundation continued to grow and gain recognition. As it expanded its outreach, it attracted the attention of local schools, where it was incorporated into educational programs. The focus of the foundation was on emotional intelligence, teaching children and parents how to recognize and express their emotions in healthy ways. Tyler's story became a catalyst for these conversations, making his loss a source of strength for countless others. Tyler's friends, now in their 30s, had gone on to build lives that were deeply influenced by the tragedy they had experienced. Many of them became counselors, social workers, and advocates for mental health awareness. They found healing not in revenge or bitterness, but in the act of helping others avoid the mistakes they had seen in Angela and Tyler's relationship. Each of Tyler's friends had come to terms with his death in their own way. Some found solace in their careers, others in their families. But one thing was universal. They would never forget the boy they had lost. He was a constant presence in their lives. Not a memory they could bury, but a light that would forever guide them. Tyler's mother, for all her progress in therapy, was still trapped in a state of perpetual remorse. As years passed, she was given more freedom within the prison system, but she never sought to connect with anyone. There were no letters to her parents, no attempts to re-establish contact with any family members. She had lost them all when she killed Tyler, and she knew that nothing could ever repair that rift. Angela had no family left to lean on, and even her fellow inmates could not understand the depth of her suffering. She had become a pariah in her own prison, a woman whose crime was too great to ever forgive. Angela's name had become synonymous with betrayal. The woman who was supposed to nurture and protect had destroyed the very thing she held most dear. The years of isolation weighed heavily on Angela's psyche. She often found herself lost in thoughts about Tyler, wondering how his life would have turned out had she not ended it. Would he have been a successful artist? Would he have found happiness in ways she never could? Every unanswered question left her with a gnawing emptiness. One night, as Angela lay in her prison cot, she was visited by a strange, fleeting vision. In this dream, Tyler appeared before her, his smile as bright as it had been in life. He didn't speak, but his eyes communicated something that Angela had never expected: forgiveness. For a moment, Angela thought she saw the boy she had killed offering her the one thing she had desperately wanted for years. But as quickly as it appeared, the vision faded, leaving Angela with more questions than answers. Was it simply a product of her guilt? Or had Tyler, in some unimaginable way, granted her peace, even in his death? Angela never knew, but the vision stayed with her. It gave her a glimmer of hope, however fleeting. Tyler's friends, now well established in their careers, still visited Cartersville every year on the anniversary of his death. It had become a tradition for them to gather at the local memorial park, where they planted flowers in his honor. They shared stories, laughed, and cried, remembering the friend who had been taken from them too soon. It was their way of keeping his memory alive. The memorial for Tyler had become a place of pilgrimage for those who had known him. People from the town, his old schoolmates, and even strangers who had heard his story, came to pay their respects. It was a place filled with both grief and gratitude, a place where people could mourn the loss of a bright future while finding solace in the legacy Tyler had left behind. Angela, from the isolation of her prison, had no idea that Tyler's memory continued to grow stronger with each passing year. She never knew about the foundation, the memorial, or the impact his death had had on so many people. She had no connection to the outside world, except through fleeting moments of introspection and dreams that only seemed to confuse her. In the final years of her sentence, Angela began to fade into the background of the prison system. The initial media frenzy surrounding her trial and conviction had long since passed. Now she was just another inmate serving out her life sentence, a woman who had taken her own son's life and could never escape the consequences. But even in the quiet of prison, Angela's guilt never truly left her. Every day was a reminder of the terrible mistake she had made. No amount of therapy, no passing years, could erase the horror of what she had done. She had destroyed a life that had been entrusted to her, and she would never be able to forget that. Tyler's story continued to live on. not in the absence of tragedy, but because of it. It was a story that resonated with anyone who had ever felt misunderstood, isolated, or overwhelmed. Tyler's life, though short, became a beacon for others, a reminder that mental health struggles should never be ignored and that love should never turn to violence. For the community of Cartersville, Tyler's death remained a turning point. It had changed how they viewed mental health, how they interacted with one another, and how they supported their children. Angela's crime, while devastating, had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own vulnerabilities and the importance of compassion. Angela, at the time of her death in prison, was a broken woman. Her life had been consumed by regret, and the peace she had briefly glimpsed in her vision of Tyler had never materialized. The finality of her sentence and her ultimate death only served as a tragic conclusion to a story that was never meant to be. In the years that followed Angela's death, Tyler's legacy continued to grow. His story was told to future generations, both as a cautionary tale and as an inspiration to live with empathy and understanding. The impact of his life, though brief, had a ripple effect on everyone who encountered it. The story of Tyler's death was not just a tale of one family's tragedy. It became a pivotal moment for many families, who began to rethink their relationships and the emotional needs of their children. Schools and local community groups started offering parenting workshops, focusing on emotional health and communication. Tyler's story had shown them the consequences of neglecting these areas. In the years that followed, multiple documentaries about Angela and Tyler's case were produced. Some were sympathetic to Angela, exploring the depths of her mental illness, while others focused on Tyler's life and his tragic end. One such documentary, The Price of Silence, became especially popular, showing how the community, in its silence, failed both Angela and Tyler. It was a raw exploration of how mental health issues within families could often go unnoticed until it was too late. Tyler's old friends, now well into their 40s, had gone on to lead fulfilling lives, but they all carried with them the weight of his memory. Many of them had children of their own, and they used their experience to raise their kids with a new sense of understanding. They made sure to teach them the importance of kindness, communication, and the necessity of reaching out for help when feeling lost. They often spoke about Tyler when they gathered, reminding their children about the importance of empathy and openness. It was these conversations that helped them process their own grief. For these parents, Tyler had become a symbol of how easily lives could go off course when emotions were left unchecked. At one point, one of Tyler's childhood friends, who had grown into a mental health professional, wrote a book about his experiences. Titled The Echo of Silence, it was a deep dive into the story of Tyler's life and death, and how the ripple effects had shaped the lives of everyone who knew him. It was a book that helped people understand how a young man's silence in the face of family dysfunction could be fatal. The book went viral, and the conversations it sparked helped to educate people about how difficult it could be for young people to communicate their struggles. Many readers said the book helped them recognize red flags in their own relationships and understand the subtle signs of emotional turmoil. It became a resource for schools, community groups, and counseling centers around the country. Angela, wherever she was in her prison cell, had no way of knowing how far-reaching her son's legacy had become. Her self-inflicted isolation from the world meant she had never seen the impact of her crime on society at large. All she could do was reflect on the time she had with Tyler, and the fatal mistake that she could never undo. After the documentary and the book, Tyler's Foundation reached new heights. It expanded its reach into neighboring states, helping families in crisis, providing counseling services, and even creating a program for incarcerated individuals to receive mental health treatment before they left prison. Tyler's name was now synonymous with hope, even in the darkest situations. The Foundation's success did not go unnoticed. Various philanthropic organizations reached out, offering grants to further expand the programs. The young man, who had been a victim of his mother's unchecked rage, had become the face of a movement, an advocate for mental health reform in a society that often ignored it until tragedy struck. Meanwhile, Angela's life in prison continued with no real change. She had become a prisoner of her own memories, haunted by the image of Tyler every waking moment. She had tried to find solace in prayer, in art, in the rare moments of peace granted by her solitary life. But nothing could erase the face of the son she had killed. She spent her days working on prison projects, often writing poems and essays about motherhood and regret. They were never published, but they allowed her to express the feelings that had been trapped inside her for so long. In her writing, Angela frequently spoke of her deep remorse, but also of the confusion that lingered around her emotions. Had she truly loved Tyler, or had she loved the idea of him? At times, Angela would write letters that she never sent, letters addressed to Tyler. In them, she would ask for forgiveness, beg for his understanding, and express the hopelessness that she felt. These letters, filled with emotion and regret, were her only form of communication with her lost son. They became a kind of ritual for her, a daily penance that, in her mind, might somehow lessen the burden of her crime. As the years passed, Angela's mental state deteriorated. The prison system, unable to provide the level of psychological care she needed, saw her become a mere shadow of the woman who had entered it years ago. Her once vibrant personality was now a faint memory, and her only real connection to the outside world came from the media stories about her son's legacy. Tyler's old friends often spoke of how his death had shattered them, but how they had rebuilt their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. They often gathered at the Foundation's events, recounting memories of Tyler that highlighted his warmth, his laughter, and his ability to brighten any room. Even as adults, they could still hear his voice in their minds, urging them to push forward in the face of adversity. At one such event, a mural was unveiled in Tyler's memory. It depicted him as a young man surrounded by his friends, laughing, with a bright future ahead of him. The mural was painted on the side of the town's community center, and it became a place of reflection for everyone who passed by. People left flowers and letters, and some even left messages about their own struggles and triumphs. For the people of Cartersville, Tyler's story had become a part of their identity. They remembered him not for his tragic death, but for the lessons he had inadvertently taught them. They had learned to be more open with their emotions, to check in on their loved ones, and to never assume that everything was okay on the surface. They had learned that silence, even in the most well-meaning family, could be deadly. Angela's life in prison ended in her late 60s. She had spent the last years of her life alone, cut off from the world outside. Her final days were spent in a quiet, private room, where she often stared at the photographs of her son that she had kept in a small box. On the day of her death, there were no visitors, no family, no friends, only the quiet stillness that had defined her last years. Tyler's legacy continued, however, far beyond his mother's death. His story became an important chapter in the ongoing dialogue about mental health and its effects on families. Schools, therapists, and community leaders frequently referenced his life to explain the importance of emotional connection and intervention before a tragedy could occur. The foundation continued to grow, with new initiatives aimed at creating youth programs that taught emotional intelligence and conflict resolution. Tyler's name lived on as a beacon for all who were affected by mental health struggles, offering support and guidance to those who felt as lost and isolated as Tyler had been in the months before his death. In the years that followed, Tyler's friends often returned to Cartersville for reunions, marking the anniversaries of his death with moments of silence and remembrance. They never forgot the boy who had been their friend, whose laughter had once filled their lives. They knew that even though his life had been cut short, his impact on their world would be felt for generations. Angela's story in the end was not just one of a mother who had murdered her child. It was a story of deep personal turmoil, of a woman trapped in her own emotional prison. Her guilt was immense, but her failure to seek help, to truly confront her own issues, was perhaps her greatest crime. Tyler's legacy, by contrast, was one of hope. Despite his tragic death, his name lived on in the work of those who had been touched by his story. His death had inspired change, conversations, and a renewed focus on the importance of emotional well-being. It was a legacy that outlasted both him and his mother, ensuring that the lessons learned from his short life would continue to guide future generations. As the years passed, Tyler's story became a staple in discussions about the importance of early intervention in mental health. Schools around the country started to implement mandatory programs for emotional education, with Tyler's foundation being at the forefront of these efforts. The foundation's efforts to promote emotional awareness were a direct reflection of how much could be lost when emotional needs were neglected. Tyler's friends, now with children of their own, found themselves in a role they never expected to play, the role of guardians of Tyler's memory. They ensured that their own children understood the value of empathy, compassion, and openness. They shared with their kids the story of their lost friend, teaching them not just about the importance of mental health, but about the fragility of life itself. Through these efforts, Tyler's life continued to echo throughout the generations. His death, though tragic, had ignited a spark of change that could never be extinguished. People spoke of Tyler not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for a shift in societal consciousness. A young boy whose death had saved countless others from the same fate. Tyler's name appeared in countless articles, documentaries, and educational programs. He was cited in textbooks discussing mental health and parental responsibility. His case was used as an example of the extreme consequences that could arise from emotional neglect, and how a simple failure to communicate could lead to unimaginable loss. Meanwhile, Angela's death was quietly acknowledged, but her story was seen less as a cautionary tale of what can happen when a mother loses control, and more as a tragic illustration of the dangers of unaddressed mental health issues. In the years after her death, some who had known her began to look back with more sympathy, seeing her actions as a product of deep pain rather than inherent evil. Still, the memory of her crime would never be erased. At Tyler's memorial, the first major anniversary after Angela's death, a candlelight vigil was held in his honor. People from all over the country attended, many of whom had been touched by Tyler's story in unexpected ways. The event became a moment of collective healing for the community, where people gathered not just to mourn, but to acknowledge the importance of emotional health and the lives that could be saved through awareness. One of Tyler's childhood friends, now a successful therapist, gave a moving speech at the vigil. She spoke of how her understanding of life, love, and loss had been forever shaped by her experience with Tyler. She reflected on their childhood together and how she had never imagined that something as innocent as Tyler's struggles would eventually lead to his untimely death. Her words resonated with everyone in attendance, many of whom had struggled with their own silent battles. The Foundation's annual gala, which had become one of the most anticipated events in the area, also served as a place to raise awareness and funds for those who needed help. Tyler's story had propelled the cause to national attention, and people now flocked to support the programs that his death had inspired. There were auctions, speeches, and performances all centered on the theme of emotional resilience. At one such gala, a young girl no older than 12 took the stage to deliver a powerful poem she had written about the importance of speaking out and seeking help. She spoke of how Tyler's story had inspired her to be brave, to share her own struggles with her family and friends. It was an emotional moment that brought many in the crowd to tears, and it reminded them of why they had gathered in the first place. Tyler's legacy continued to grow, with more and more people coming forward to share their own experiences of how his story had touched their lives. The Foundation's programs expanded into international communities, with workshops on mental health and emotional wellness being held in places as far as Europe, Asia, and Africa. Tyler's death had sparked a global conversation that was just beginning to take shape. Angela, in her final days, was unaware of the worldwide impact Tyler had made. She was only left with the haunting image of her son's face, a reminder of the life she had taken. In her quiet moments, Angela would often whisper his name, almost as if calling out to him for forgiveness. But she knew in her heart that there would be no absolution for what she had done. Despite her attempts to reach some level of self-understanding in the years before her death, Angela's peace remained elusive. She had spent so much time trying to reconcile with her guilt, but there was nothing that could undo her crime. Even as she aged in prison, her internal struggle remained unchanged. Her mind never truly stopped trying to answer the same question. Why had she done it? Why had she let her frustrations consume her to the point of murder? In the years following Tyler's death, his story began to find its place in history. It was included in lessons about how communities and families should address mental health issues before they become crises. Tyler's case had highlighted the importance of breaking the silence and understanding the needs of those who are often the most vulnerable: children. As Tyler's story was retold in books, documentaries, and films, his death was no longer seen solely as the result of a mother's deranged behavior, but as part of a larger narrative about mental illness, emotional neglect, and the profound effects of unaddressed psychological struggles. Tyler had not just been a victim, he had been the spark for a movement that would change the lives of many others. By the time the community gathered for Tyler's final memorial service, years after both his mother and himself had passed, a sense of closure had begun to form. While the grief never fully faded, people had come to realize that Tyler had lived an extraordinary life, one that was filled with potential. His death had, in a way, honored that potential by catalyzing a movement that would save countless lives. Tyler's friends, now in their 50s, had children of their own, but they would never forget the boy who had shaped their lives. Every year, they returned to Cartersville, where they laid flowers at Tyler's grave and shared their stories with their children about the importance of understanding one another's emotional struggles. Tyler's memory was one of love, not loss. Love for the boy who had been their friend, who had taught them so much in so little time. One of Tyler's closest friends, a teacher now, had written a letter that was placed in the town's memory book. The letter read, "Tyler may have left us too soon, but his spirit continues to live on in all of us. He taught us the importance of love, of communication, and most of all, that no one is ever truly alone, no matter how dark the world may seem." It was a message that resonated deeply with everyone in attendance at the memorial. For the town of Cartersville, Tyler's death had become more than just a painful memory. It had become a defining moment in their collective history. The town that had once failed to see the signs had now become a beacon of awareness and hope. Tyler's story had illuminated their blind spots, and they had risen to meet the challenge. As Tyler's memorial service concluded, his friends and the community members took one final moment to reflect on the boy who had made such a lasting impact on their lives. They knew that his death had not been in vain. His memory, now forever etched into the fabric of their town, would continue to inspire generations to come. In the end, Tyler's death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It was a reminder of how fragile life is and how important it is to recognize the emotional struggles of those around us. Tyler had been the victim of his circumstances, but his story had sparked a wave of change that would reverberate for years to come. And in that change, there was a small piece of redemption, not for Angela, but for everyone who had been touched by Tyler's life. His death had caused pain, but it had also brought healing. It had been a catalyst for action, and in that, there was hope. The town of Cartersville had grown into a place of reflection, its residents no longer taking things for granted. Tyler's death had opened their eyes to the vulnerabilities within their own families and communities. They began to speak more openly about mental health, and they learned how to better care for each other emotionally. The educational reforms, driven by the Tyler Foundation, had begun to spread across the nation. Emotional health programs were becoming a staple in schools, with students being taught not only academic lessons but also the importance of self-awareness and emotional expression. Tyler's story was often cited as a powerful example of why these changes were so necessary. Tyler's friends, now parents themselves, often found themselves telling their children about him in ways they hadn't anticipated. They no longer spoke about him simply as a lost friend, but as a teacher. They spoke about his life and his struggles, emphasizing the importance of kindness, vulnerability, and the need to speak up when something doesn't feel right. A few years after the memorial, the town's high school unveiled a scholarship fund in Tyler's name. It was dedicated to students who demonstrated resilience, leadership, and a commitment to helping others. Tyler's friends had raised the funds for the scholarship, ensuring that his legacy would live on in the form of young people who embodied the values that Tyler's story had taught them. The first recipient of the Tyler Memorial Scholarship was a young girl named Clara, whose story mirrored some of Tyler's own struggles. She had faced immense emotional challenges due to her family's issues, but had found solace in expressing herself through art and community service. During her acceptance speech, Clara spoke about how Tyler's story had given her the courage to overcome her fears and reach out for help when she needed it most. Her words touched the hearts of everyone in the room, reaffirming the power of Tyler's legacy. In the years that followed, the Tyler Foundation continued to grow and adapt to the evolving needs of the community. It established a hotline for parents struggling with their children's emotional needs and partnered with schools to provide counseling services. The foundation also worked closely with lawmakers to advocate for policies that would provide more mental health resources to those in need, especially families facing challenges similar to those Tyler had endured. Tyler's friends, still deeply affected by his death, often visited schools to speak with students. They would tell stories of the boy they had known and loved, the boy who had been their friend, and the boy who had inspired them to live their lives with purpose. Their speeches were often raw, emotional, and incredibly powerful, as they reminded the audience that every life, no matter how short, had the potential to make a lasting impact. As Tyler's story spread further across the country, his death became a part of the larger conversation about the responsibility of families and communities in nurturing the emotional well-being of children. His life became a symbol of the dangers of neglecting those who are silently struggling, and it prompted widespread efforts to make mental health a priority in both schools and communities. Tyler's story also inspired numerous artists, writers, and musicians. Several songs were written in his memory, capturing the deep sense of loss and longing that had been felt by those who knew him. These songs became anthems for those dealing with grief and mental health struggles. Tyler had, in death, become a muse for a creative wave that gave voice to those who had been silenced by their own struggles. But even as Tyler's legacy grew, there were moments of deep sorrow. Some of his childhood friends still struggled with the guilt of not having done enough to help him. They questioned if they could have done something differently, if they had seen the signs, if they had been more attentive. These feelings of guilt, while not uncommon in cases like Tyler's, were something they carried with them, despite the healing efforts that had taken place. Angela's story, too, was revisited in the years following Tyler's death. And as time went on, more people began to understand the complexities of her situation. It became clear that her actions were not solely driven by malice, but by a deep-seated psychological illness that had never been properly addressed. While many still saw her as the villain in this story, others took a more nuanced view, recognizing that she, too, had been a victim of her own unaddressed mental health struggles. Some of Angela's old friends and family members came forward in the years after her death, sharing their own reflections on her life. They spoke about her isolation, the constant pressure she had felt as a mother, and the emotional breakdowns she had suffered in private. These testimonies added layers to the understanding of her behavior, but they did little to absolve her of the crime she had committed. Still, they painted a picture of a woman who, much like Tyler, had been trapped in her own psychological prison. Tyler's death had become a painful but important lesson for everyone who had been touched by it. It reminded them of the fragility of life, the importance of emotional care, and the need to recognize when someone is struggling. Tyler's friends, now middle-aged, carried this lesson with them into their own families and communities. They knew that while they couldn't change the past, they could shape the future by ensuring that they were always there for those who needed them. As the years turned into decades, Tyler's legacy remained firmly in place. The annual gatherings in his memory continued to grow, drawing people from all over the country who had been touched by his story. The scholarship fund continued to help deserving students, and the foundation's work in mental health education and support expanded internationally. Tyler had, in death, become something much larger than the boy he had been in life. His name was synonymous with change, hope, and healing. His death, while tragic, had become the catalyst for a movement that would ensure that no other child would suffer in silence, that no other parent would feel that there was no way out. Tyler's story had transformed the lives of countless people, and his legacy was now a part of history, forever, reminding the world of the importance of mental health, family, and love.